I know there have been times when you had a headache and just took some medicine and went to rest. But what if I told you that those seemingly harmless headaches can sometimes be the brain's final warning? I still remember Mrs. Linda clearly. She was a 79-year-old woman living in Florida. Every morning, she walked 15 minutes around her house, ate a regular breakfast, drank enough water, and didn't take any prescription medications. She didn't smoke, didn't drink alcohol, and didn't even have high blood pressure. A very disciplined person, and everyone thought she was healthy. That afternoon, she went to the supermarket as usual. When she got home, she felt a slight headache on one side. Because it was a hot day, she thought it was due to dehydration or lack of sleep. She didn't say anything to her daughter, just turned on the fan, drank a glass of water, and lay down to rest. I know this because a few hours later, her daughter called emergency services. By then, Mrs. Linda couldn't speak clearly anymore. Her left hand dropped the glass and couldn't pick it up, and her face began to show slight drooping. When I saw Mrs. Linda's brain scan, I truly paused for a moment. A small blood vessel in the language area was blocked. What shocked me was that the first sign of the stroke wasn't loss of consciousness, seizures, or a spike in blood pressure, but a mild headache in the afternoon. What made me think deeper was this: Mrs. Linda had no underlying conditions, no clear risk factors, no typical symptoms. Nothing at all, except one thing: a headache she thought was minor. So, standing in the scan room, watching her unable to say a complete sentence, I asked myself many times, if I were a family member, would I have noticed something unusual? Or would I have simply thought my mom was tired? Mrs. Linda's story is why today I want to share this with you, not just logically, but through real experience. A headache, if it happens at the wrong time, from an important blood vessel, and is not quickly heeded. Sometimes it's the brain's last signal to us. And I truly hope you stay until the end of this video. Because I will explain the 3 types of headaches that people over 60 need to watch for, how to quickly check at home to not miss the golden window, and the story of another mother who was saved just because her daughter noticed one very small detail. But before that, I want you to see more clearly the honest perspectives of those who have experienced this feeling, the feeling of thinking everything is normal, but in reality, the brain has already started to cry for help. Mrs. Linda later told me that when the headache first started, she really wasn't worried. She said she could still walk, still clean the kitchen, cook dinner, and laugh normally with her granddaughter. The pain wasn't severe or widespread, just a dull ache on one side behind the forehead. She simply thought it was some tension from being out in the sun. About an hour later, she stood up to pour water, and her left hand started to tremble slightly. She had to use her right hand to hold the glass. But then she thought it was just fatigue and didn't tell anyone. She sat down on the sofa, tried to take deep breaths, and told her granddaughter to let her rest soon. By then, her voice began to weaken a bit but was still understandable. She only felt slight numbness on one side of her mouth and stumbled over a few words. Her granddaughter joked that maybe she just had a mild cold. But that moment was the turning point between a normal headache and a stroke slowly unfolding. What made me think the most was that Mrs. Linda wasn't panicking. She didn't have severe pain, didn't scream, didn't collapse on the floor. She just felt her body was a little strange but still thought she'd be okay. And that's the scariest part of this silent onset stroke. She told me, "I thought I was just tired. I just needed rest." Honestly, at that time, I didn't feel any danger. She smiled softly telling me this, but there was something different in her eyes. Perhaps a regret for not listening to those early signs sooner. And from that moment, I wanted to do something bigger. For people like Mrs. Linda. People who think they're okay. People who only feel a slight headache, but whose brains are actually facing something invisible. Looking back at all her early symptoms, I realized one thing: Not all headaches are the same. Some are clear warnings, but some are very silent, creeping into the most ordinary moments. That's why I want you to join me for the next part. To understand what her family was thinking at that time. Because that's a perspective you may have experienced too when an elderly loved one tells you they're just a little tired. Mrs. Linda's daughter was the one who took her to the hospital that day. She told me in a quiet voice that when her mother mentioned the headache, she simply thought it was the heat. That week had been hotter than usual, and since her mom often walked outside in the mornings and evenings, she figured it was just dehydration. When her mom said she had a headache, she gave her a cold glass of water and told her to rest. She even said, "Mom, sleep a bit, I'll warm up some porridge later to make it easier for you." When I asked if she had any doubts at that time, she shook her head and said, "I'd never seen Mom seriously ill before. She was always healthy, moving quickly." I didn't think otherwise. But when I asked about details, did Mom's hand tremble, did her speech slow? She paused for a few seconds then said, "I remember Mom's words were a bit slurred. I thought she was just sleepy. I even teased her for talking like she was dreaming." At that moment, I really didn't think it was serious. It wasn't until Mom dropped the glass of water a second time and couldn't speak clearly anymore that she started to worry. But instead of calling emergency immediately, she waited a bit longer, hoping her mom would get better. One more hour passed, and everything had changed completely. I don't blame her because I understand family members often don't expect the worst to happen so suddenly. But that's exactly why each of us needs to learn to read those subtle signs in loved ones, even if it's just a very small change. When I asked her what she would do differently if she could go back, she held my hand tightly and said, "If I could go back, I'd call the doctor the moment Mom stumbled on the first word. No waiting, no guessing." When she said that, I didn't see her as a mistaken daughter. I saw her as one of thousands living with elderly loved ones at home, and sometimes, just a bit of carelessness, a bit of routine, means missing a golden opportunity. No one wants bad things to happen. But if no one in the family notices, if no one truly listens, the brain will have no way to ask for help anymore. And when a loved one can no longer move or speak, what's left is a very long silence. I think the saddest thing is not that the stroke happened, but that it happened while the whole family still thought everything was normal. And to understand how quickly the brain can change in just 1 hour, I'll share with you my perspective standing in front of Mrs. Linda's brain scan, seeing the fragility and complexity of the brain we take for granted every day. I still vividly remember the moment I held Mrs. Linda's brain scan in my hands. It was an MRI taken at 8:45 p.m., just minutes after she was admitted to the ER. On that image, there was a tiny dark spot, no bigger than a fingertip, located in the left frontal lobe, the very area controlling her speech and language expression. It looked like a small black dot among thousands of bright brain folds, but to me, it was unmistakable. A small blood vessel had become blocked. The issue wasn't the size but the location. The brain doesn't need much damage, just the right spot in the center controlling language or movement, to cause immediate dysfunction. Mrs. Linda had no high blood pressure, no diabetes, no heart disease. But the brain's blood vessels in elderly people are always more fragile, like tiny side roads winding through forests. If one branch suddenly gets blocked, the whole area downstream loses nourishment. I remember standing there reading the results. I paused for a few seconds. I wasn't shocked because I hadn't seen strokes before. I was shocked because it came from a patient with no obvious risk factors, and it started with a symptom so mild it's easy to overlook. The headache she felt that afternoon wasn't random. It was the first signal the vessels beginning to constrict, blood flow slowing or pressure dropping. That pain was like a soft knock on the door of a room running out of oxygen. If it had been heated, everything might have been prevented. I recall standing beside her hospital bed. I asked her quietly, "Did you notice anything unusual about the headache before this happened?" She nodded slightly and whispered, it felt like an old pain, but something was different. That answer made me ponder for a long time. Because if, at that moment, someone had asked a follow-up question, if anyone had noticed her slight hand tremor or slowed speech, maybe blood flow could have been restored before that brain area faded away. That's why, from that day forward, I changed the way I question patients. I don't just ask if they have headaches. I ask what kind of headache it is, how it differs from others, and when it started after what event. That's how I realized the brain always signals problems in advance, we just don't have the habit of listening carefully enough. And from that story, I began making these videos. Because I know there are people living with elderly parents who don't know how to distinguish a normal headache from a silent warning from the brain. If you're reading this, I invite you to join me in the next part, where we'll explore the 3 most dangerous types of headaches in seniors, how to recognize them in under a minute, and hear about another mother saved just because her daughter noticed a tiny detail. To understand why a small headache can be a sign of stroke, we need to look at brain function in the simplest way. Your brain is less than 2% of your body weight, but uses over 20% of your blood and oxygen per minute. That means even a slight reduction in blood flow affects the entire nervous system. In young people, if vessels constrict slightly, the body compensates by increasing heart rate or breathing deeper. But in those over 60, vessels harden and lose elasticity, making them more vulnerable to abnormal blood pressure fluctuations. If a small vessel in the brain suddenly blocks, the area it feeds will be deprived. The first sensation patients often feel is a strange headache different from tension headaches, stress, or insomnia they've had before. That pain may be on one side, in a small area, lasting a few minutes. It's not necessarily severe but described as very unusual discomfort. Patients may feel slightly off balance, have difficulty speaking, or struggle to find words. This means the brain's language or balance area is lightly affected, not yet paralyzed or unconscious. If caught at this stage, intervention can reverse the damage. I always advise patients to remember 3 headache types needing urgent attention. First, a headache on one side, accompanied by heaviness or numbness in one face or shoulder. Second, a headache with difficulty speaking, slurred words, or inability to recall words. Third, a headache described as strange, unlike anything before. If you or a loved one experiences any of these, don't guess. Don't just take painkillers and sleep it off. Call a doctor or go immediately for brain imaging. Also, I want to remind you of a simple test called Fast 4 Easy Steps, very important. F. Face. Ask the person to smile. If one side of the face droops, it's a warning sign. A. Arms. Ask them to raise both arms. If one arm drops, there might be slight paralysis. S. Speech. Ask them to repeat a simple sentence. Slurred or incorrect speech is dangerous. T. Time. If any sign is present, call emergency immediately. The sooner, the better. The golden window to save brain tissue is about 3 to 4 hours from symptom onset. After that, the risk of permanent damage rises rapidly. Sadly, most who arrive late had earlier signs but thought it was nothing serious. That's why I made this video. I don't want another person to regret ignoring a headache that seemed harmless. At the end, I'll share how our community is starting to change its view on these subtle signs, and how each of us can become the guardian of memory, mobility, and voice for ourselves or our loved ones. After years working with seniors across the U.S., I realized we tend to see headaches as a personal, private symptom, something everyone has experienced and not worth troubling others about. I asked 50 elderly patients, if you wake up tomorrow with a headache but can still walk and talk, what would you do? 43 said they'd take a painkiller and carry on as usual. Only 3 said they'd call a doctor or ask someone to check. Of those 3, 2 had witnessed family members suffer strokes. This shows we still don't take headaches seriously enough, especially in older adults. I understand many hesitate, afraid to bother others, fear appearing weak, or just used to enduring. We grew up in times when illness was only discussed when it was too late. But the brain doesn't wait until we are ready. It sends signals only once. If ignored, it goes silent forever. I once attended a community meeting at a small church in New Jersey. An elderly woman shared that her husband almost had a stroke because she let him lie down 10 more minutes that morning, thinking he just had a stiff neck. She said, "My daughter came home just in time, noticed Dad was slow to speak, and immediately called emergency. Thankfully, it was in time. If I had let him lie another 10 minutes, I might never have heard him call my name again." I can't forget how she spoke, voice trembling but determined. After that meeting, many began sharing signs they had overlooked: numbness on one side while brushing teeth, stumbling speech while cooking, but dismissing it as anxiety or lack of sleep. I realized the power of community is here. We don't need medical expertise. We just need to stop ignoring unusual signs, ask one more question, look one more second, listen one more time. I hope from this video on, you'll never dismiss an unusual headache again. If you've had a similar experience, please share it in the comments. Because your story might help someone else notice something crucial before it's too late. Before we close, I want to share one last thought. Not as a doctor, but as someone who has stood in many emergency rooms, feeling the weight of regret. If you've listened this far, I believe you're not just concerned about a headache. You truly want to understand your body, your loved ones, and how to protect what's most precious, something many realize only when it's too late. Morning clarity. We often think those things are obvious, natural. But in reality, just 1 second of blockage in a brain vessel can change everything. I am not telling you Linda's story to scare you. I tell it because I want you to remember that some things are completely preventable if we just pause for 1 more second, ask 1 more question, and believe that our strange feeling is worth listening to. If there are 3 things you carry with you after this video, I hope they are: first, remember that not all headaches are the same. The strange, unusual, sudden ones, especially in older adults, should never be taken lightly. Second, never hesitate to call a doctor if something makes you feel uneasy. One timely phone call could preserve an entire part of your life. Third, share with others if you have ever experienced something similar. The power of sharing may not save someone instantly, but it could help someone wake up a little earlier. And if you are caring for your parents or living with elderly loved ones, I just hope you remember: behind every furrowed brow, every slight tremor in the hand, every moment the speech slows down may be a quiet cry for help from the brain. You do not have to be a doctor. You just have to be someone who notices, who listens, and who loves enough. If you have ever experienced a strange headache, share it in the comments. Who knows, your story may be what helps someone out there wake up healthier and more peaceful tomorrow morning. And if you found this video helpful, do not hesitate to follow. I will keep sharing with you real stories about the brain, and how we can protect it. Not with machines, but with understanding and human connection. Next week, I will tell you about a man who ignored the alarm bell in his head for 2 weeks thinking it was just fatigue. But then it took away his ability to remember his own wife's face.